The room was colder than expected, though not from the air. It was the silence. Heavy. Expectant. Like the hush before a verdict. Cameras were positioned at every angle, red lights blinking like watching eyes. This was not just another Vatican interview. This was global. Live. Final. Across from the white-robed man sat Marcus Weller, a journalist sharpened by controversy. His Oxford tongue had sliced through senators, bishops, CEOs. But today, he wanted more than a headline. He wanted a reckoning. And the man in front of him, Pope Leo XIV, was the last thread connecting centuries of mystery, morality, and silence. Leo had aged. His bones betrayed the years, but his eyes held the weight of something buried. Something ancient. Something not yet spoken. He moved slowly, reverently, lowering himself into the chair like a priest returning to confession. But this time, he wasn't the one confessing. Weller's voice cut the air like a scalpel. Your Holiness, you've presided over decades of secrecy. You've watched the church, your church, rot from within. Why didn't you speak when it mattered most? There was no sound but the faint hum of the recording equipment. Leo's fingers twitched once, subtle, almost imperceptible. He leaned forward, not in defense, but as if compelled by some inner storm to shorten the space between his past and the question in the room. He looked not at Weller, but through him. And then, he spoke. A whisper. So soft the microphone strained to catch it. So short it couldn't fill a sentence. Yet somehow, it carried the weight of a funeral bell. What happened next would never be broadcast. The Vatican feed went dark. Abrupt. Intentional. Controlled. What was said in the final seconds was wiped from every public archive. Scrubbed clean. But not forgotten. Those in the room, producers, sound techs, assistants, they all tell the same story, that Pope Leo's face had changed just before the whisper. That something passed over him, grief, terror, awe. That his eyes, for the briefest moment, looked not at a journalist, not even at the cameras, but at something behind them. Or beyond. In the hours that followed, rumors erupted. That he had seen something. That decades ago, deep in his ministry, he had witnessed an unspeakable truth, one that altered not just his theology, but his soul. One that made him weep in private and stand in silence when the world demanded noise. And then, days later, he died. No final address. No memoir. Just a whisper that will never be aired. But those who knew him say the truth is not lost. It's hidden in gestures, in glances, in carefully chosen silences scattered across his final years. And if we follow the trail backwards, through the politics, the prayers, the press, we may arrive at the thing that Pope Leo XIV could never bring himself to say out loud. So before we begin, comment where you're watching from. Because what you're about to hear, will leave you speechless. If this already stirs something in you, don't scroll away. Subscribe. And if you don't feel anything, go to the comments, and tell the world why. He had once walked barefoot through rain-soaked villages in the Andes, offering prayers in languages he had learned from memory and love. Before the throne, before the gold ring kissed by pilgrims and presidents alike, before the papal seal ever knew his name, he was simply Father Carlo Benedetti, a missionary among forgotten people. The world would later know him as Pope Leo XIV. He never campaigned for the papacy. He had no appetite for corridors of power. But when the conclave locked behind crimson doors and the ballots were whispered between bishops, his name surfaced again and again. Like a quiet conscience the church couldn't shake. When the white smoke rose, many in Rome whispered it was a sign of penance, not politics. That God had chosen not a politician, but a witness. And a witness he had become. Throughout his decades as Pope, Leo XIV refused the papal palace. He lived in a guest house. He declined bodyguards. He washed the feet of prisoners and slipped into hospitals unannounced, holding hands without press or praise. But it wasn't just his humility that stirred the faithful. It was his silence. He rarely spoke to the press. He refused political endorsement. He declined Vatican investigations on matters where others expected noise. To some, this made him holy. To others, suspicious. But in quiet circles, whispers grew. Whispers that he had once seen something. That in his years as a missionary, far from cameras and canon law, Leo had witnessed an event, or perhaps an evil, that had no name. And that since that day, his entire ministry was built not on tradition, but on haunted obedience. Those close to him said he would sometimes weep during Massachusetts. That he would wake in the night calling out a name no one recognized. That he fasted when no one was looking. That his private journals, now locked in a marble vault beneath St. Peter's, were filled not with theological musings, but sketches. Symbols. Shapes. He had never explained any of it. And now, he never would. Because what the world didn't yet know as he sat across from the journalist that day was that this interview would be his last. Not just the final one before his retirement. The final one before his death, a truth even his closest advisors were not yet prepared to face. Opposite him sat a man who couldn't have been more different. Marcus Weller. 36. British. Award-winning. Cut from the cloth of hard facts, harder sarcasm, and an almost pathological need to unmask the myth. He'd spent his 20s dragging political liars through televised fire. His documentaries had sparked resignations, lawsuits, and once, a nationwide apology from the Anglican Church. But today's prey was bigger. This wasn't a bishop. It was a pope. A living icon. And Weller had been granted a seat in front of him, not by persuasion, but by invitation. It was Leo himself who requested the interview. The Vatican offered no explanation. No script. No restrictions. Only a time. And a single instruction from the Pope's secretary: bring no questions. Bring only your honesty. The studio had been built inside a Vatican annex normally used for high-level conclaves. Crimson drapes. Mahogany floors. No windows. Just 2 chairs, a small table, and a globe carved from olive wood, spinning slowly between them. The audience was invisible, but massive. A simultaneous live broadcast was being aired across 4 continents, the BBC, ABC, CBC, and dozens of digital platforms. Every major Western outlet had RSVP'd to the feed. Headlines had been teased for days. Even secular watchers were curious. This wasn't just history. It was theater. But what no one realized was that this wouldn't follow any script. That the man they came to corner was not afraid of being exposed. Because he knew something no one else did. And because time was running out. This wasn't a show. It was a testimony. And every breath he took was one breath closer to the truth he had never spoken. This was no ordinary interview. This was a man's last public moment. Subscribe now. Or enter the comments section and explain why this legacy, this confrontation between a dying pope and a rising skeptic, doesn't deserve your attention. The silence before the first question was long enough to feel chosen. Not awkward, not unsure, deliberate. Like both men knew the weight of what was about to begin, though only one understood why. Marcus Weller leaned forward slightly, fingers interlocked, his voice measured, polished, and wrapped in civility. Your Holiness, he began, some say the Church is clinging to relevance in a world that no longer needs it. We have science, democracy, human rights institutions. Is faith still necessary, or merely nostalgic? He smiled as he finished. A gracious tone, but underneath it, a spark. He wasn't asking. He was baiting. And he believed the man in white across from him would take it. But Leo didn't lean forward. He didn't blink. He didn't even smile. He breathed once, slowly. Then answered. "Science tells us how the stars form," he said, voice steady, soft but filled with iron. "Faith tells us why we bother looking up at them." The response wasn't defensive. It didn't argue. It didn't explain. It just was. And something about the way he said it, quiet, simple, unshaken, thinned the smirk on Weller's face just slightly. Weller nodded, regrouped. "Of course," he said. "But surely the moral arc of civilization no longer depends on religion. We legislate rights, we prosecute abuse, we educate citizens. Hasn't humanity evolved past the need for spiritual authority?" Leo's reply came even faster this time. "When a child falls in the dark," he said, "they don't cry out for a constitution. They cry out for someone they believe can hear them." Another pause. "And then, laws guide society. But belief sustains the soul. No hint of anger. No need to impress. Just a calm unraveling of the question at its root." Weller glanced at his notes, shifting slightly in his seat, not because he had lost confidence, but because something unexpected was happening. He had come for argument, but he was being met with depth. A stillness that made his words feel thinner than they had on the page. The next question came slower. "Do you believe the Church has done more good than harm?" Leo's eyes lowered, but not in shame. In memory. "I believe," he said, "that light and shadow both exist in cathedrals. Just as they do in hearts. The Church has healed, and it has wounded. But repentance without pride is redemption. And I have seen it with my own eyes." There was no pretense in his tone. He wasn't defending the institution. He was simply speaking as a man who had walked its halls, and its graveyards. The atmosphere began to shift. Not with thunder. But with gravity. In studios across New York, Toronto, Sydney, and London, hosts leaned in. Commentators paused mid-sentence. Viewers at home, many of whom tuned in with cynicism or curiosity, felt something crackle beneath the surface. The interview wasn't following the usual arc. The questions were familiar. But the air between them had begun to carry something unspoken. A tension not of debate, but of revelation waiting to emerge. Weller saw it, too. And though he wouldn't say it yet, he felt it. This man. This Pope wasn't just answering questions. He was preparing for something. And for the first time in his career, Marcus Weller wondered if he might not be the one leading the conversation after all. If you're already feeling the weight of every word, subscribe now. If not, the comments are waiting for you. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Marcus Weller adjusted his posture. His earlier ease had matured into caution. The rhythm of the conversation had escaped his grasp, and though his tone remained smooth, something behind his eyes had begun to harden. He was no longer fencing with a fragile old man. He was circling a presence, one that had chosen its silences carefully, and now, perhaps, was ready to end them. He exhaled, as if signaling the next phase. "Your Holiness," he said, tone now lower, more deliberate, "you've been praised for your humility. For your simplicity. But also criticized. For your silence. Especially when the world cried out for you to speak. About abuse. About cover-ups. About shame cloaked in incense." A pause. "You've met survivors. You've heard their stories. Why didn't you use your voice more forcefully? Why didn't you name names?" The words, though calm, struck with weight. This was no longer theoretical. This was blood and scandal. Grief and anger. The room chilled not from air, but implication. Pope Leo did not flinch. Instead, he folded his hands in his lap and looked downward, not in guilt, but in remembrance. "I met a boy in Buenos Aires," he began. He couldn't sleep unless the lights were on and someone was in the room. He was 6. The man who hurt him wore vestments. Weller remained still. The camera crews, usually invisible in their routine, slowed their movements. Even the technicians behind the glass paused. Leo continued. In Manila, I baptized a woman in her 60s. She'd waited that long to return to faith, not because she doubted God, but because she couldn't bear to kneel in the same church where her trust had once been broken. His voice did not rise. It sank. In Ireland, I stood at the grave of a priest who took his own life after confessing what he had once been ordered to conceal. Not defend, conceal. And he could no longer bear the cost of silence. Leo raised his head slowly, not toward Weller, but to the room. My silence, he said, was not cowardice. It was strategy. A hammer shatters glass, but it also shatters bone. I chose not to swing wildly, but to walk softly, and bury the truth in the right soil, so it could grow into justice, not vengeance. Weller's jaw tensed. He opened his mouth, but Leo kept going, not loudly, but with the slow force of a rising tide. There were names I could have spoken, he said. But speaking them before I had moved the right hands into the right offices would have only fed a spectacle that loves scandal more than healing. I have met the victims. I carry their names. I write them in my private prayers. Not as a pope. As a man. A pause longer than before. Then he looked at Weller, truly looked at him, for the first time. You came here hoping to find a man who hid behind robes, he said. But I have buried more innocence than you have uncovered. And I have done it without cameras, without applause, without satisfaction. There was no anger in his voice. Just weariness. Truth. Weller, for once, had no retort. His hands moved over his notes as if by reflex, but the words were not there. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full. Full of memories neither man could describe, and of faces the world would never know. Then Leo said the line that would be clipped and quoted for years to come. Politics divides. The gospel unites. It fell like scripture. Not a defense. A benediction. And in that moment, the posture of the room changed. Not in applause. But in reverence. Because even the most cynical could feel it, this was not a man dodging questions. This was a man unburdening a lifetime. Subscribe. Because this isn't gossip. This is witness. And if you still won't, then defend your silence, in the comments. It was the breaking point, but it didn't arrive with shouting or slurs. It came quietly, with the edge of a blade polished in rhetoric. Marcus Weller, whose patience had worn thin beneath the Pope's calm deflections, leaned in with a new kind of tone, not polite, not curious, sharp, stripped of artifice. His eyes no longer danced, they locked. So you're just another puppet, he said. He let the words settle like dust on sacred ground. Another man in white robes preserving the image of holiness while shielding rot. Another soft voice dressed up in moral ambiguity. You've met the monsters, and yet you kept your seat. You heard the screams, and yet you wore the ring. You wept, perhaps, but you did not speak. The accusation wasn't loud, but it echoed. In the control room, a technician dropped his pen. In a newsroom in London, a producer whispered, he said it. On the live stream, chat threads exploded. The line had been crossed. And now the world was watching for the fall. But Pope Leo did not falter. He did not defend himself. He did not reach for theology or protocol or polished response. Instead, he sat still for several long seconds. Then, slowly, he leaned forward. And began to speak. I've held dying children in my arms, he said. Children so small their ribs made music when they breathed. Some who knew only war, and some who died knowing only that someone loved them before they slipped away. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. In Ethiopia, he continued, a girl whispered a psalm to me through cracked lips, even as the fever took her. In Ukraine, I baptized a boy who had lost both his legs before his 6th birthday. In the Pacific Islands, I wept beside a mother as she laid to rest her 3rd child, none of them older than 10. His eyes lifted, not to Marcus, but to something far beyond him. You call it weakness, to choose presence over performance. To sit with suffering instead of screaming into it. But I say this, silence is not always cowardice. Sometimes, silence is what remains, when the scream would shatter the soul. Marcus opened his mouth, but no sound came. Leo went on. I've known the kind of horror that makes men question God. I've seen things that stain my faith, not because they disproved him, but because they revealed how deep his mercy must run to endure what I have witnessed. The weight of his words stilled the room. And then, without warning, he pivoted. But yes. I was silent. Because I once spoke, and no one listened. I once shouted into the halls of power, and was told I was too young to understand. And then. I saw it. A pause. Just long enough to bend time. I saw something, long ago. Not a vision. Not a dream. Something real. Something the church was never prepared to face. And I understood then that if I spoke too soon, it would be lost to politics and pride. So I waited. And I prayed. And I gathered stones. Weller stared, no longer smirking. The arrogance had cracked. What did you see? He asked. No longer a journalist, just a man asking another man for the truth. Leo didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, he looked around the room as if gathering the ghosts. And then, softly, there are things God shows only once. He placed a hand gently on his chest. And there are burdens he asks us to carry, not share. The room was frozen. No one moved. No one breathed. Because in that moment, every person watching understood, this wasn't a press moment. This was sacred ground. A confrontation that turned into confession. And a confession that felt like prophecy. That one sentence, I've held dying children in my arms. You call that weakness? Said more than a lifetime of sermons. Subscribe. Or step into the comments, and tell the world why you won't. The silence that followed Pope Leo's final words was not awkward, it was sacred. Heavy, like the silence after a verdict. Like the quiet that falls after someone finally tells the truth you weren't ready to hear. Marcus Weller sat frozen. The rhythm of the interview, his rhythm, had been taken from him, unraveled thread by thread. He looked down at his notes as if searching for rescue in bullet points and ink, but found nothing that could stand against what had just been spoken. Still, pride does not surrender easily. Not in men like Weller. His shoulders stiffened. He straightened his posture, cleared his throat, and summoned what strength remained of his journalistic instinct. But isn't it convenient, he said carefully, to frame every silence as virtue? Isn't it possible that what you call wisdom, the rest of the world sees as complicity? His tone was composed, but the edge was gone. The blade was dull now. Pope Leo XIV didn't respond immediately. He let the words hang. He understood something Marcus didn't, that silence, too, could be a weapon. That not every answer needed to arrive on time to be eternal. And then, without rush, without performance, he spoke. You confuse engagement with endorsement, he said. To be present in darkness is not to love the dark. To listen to the broken does not mean you bless the shattering. His eyes did not blink. His hands did not move. He was still, but unshakably clear. I have stood beside men I could not absolve. I have walked into rooms where I was hated. I have held the hands of victims, and those of the accused. Not because I was excusing. Because I was obeying. He leaned forward slightly, his voice quieting into something both tender and terrifying. There is a difference between protecting an institution and protecting a soul. You do not see it. Because you do not want to. Marcus inhaled to respond, but Leo was not done. Why does defending the innocent make you uncomfortable? The words hit with no volume, but with total force. And then came the silence. Studio silence. Not a breath, not a movement. In the control room, a cameraman removed his headphones without realizing it. In the green room, an executive producer lowered her clipboard. In homes and living rooms across continents, phones were set down. Viewers sat still. No scrolling. No tweeting. Just the cold, echoing realization that they were watching something no algorithm had prepared them for. Leo's voice dropped once more. You came for a headline. I came to give a eulogy. Weller blinked. He had no script for that. He had no soundbite to counter it. Because eulogies are not arguments. They are grave sites. And somewhere beneath the floorboards of that Vatican room, Pope Leo XIV had just buried the illusion of moral neutrality. He had buried the idea that silence always equals guilt. He had buried the belief that grace is weakness. And Weller, clever, prepared, relentless, had nothing to offer in return. Only silence. Because the truth had already been spoken. And it would not be spoken twice. If that hit you like it hit the studio, you already know what to do. Subscribe. If you're unmoved. Justify that in the comments. We're listening. The camera, though unmoving, seemed to shift in spirit, like the eye of the lens had widened, no longer documenting a conversation between two men, but witnessing something larger. Something more eternal. Marcus Weller said nothing now. The weight of his final question, so sharp in its intention, so empty in its effect, still hung in the air like an unanswered prayer. His notes lay untouched. His posture had softened. He looked, in this moment, not like a predator who had failed, but like a student who had just heard a truth he didn't know he needed. Pope Leo did not speak to him anymore. He turned his gaze, slowly, gently, past the cameras, past the room, toward the invisible sea of eyes watching from across the world. And then, with a voice that carried neither pride nor bitterness, but something older, something sacred, he began to speak. This was never about him, he said. Not about a journalist or a pope. Not about institutions or headlines. A pause. A breath. This is about us. About what kind of world we are choosing to build. A world of exposure without mercy. Of outrage without mourning. Of accusation without healing. He leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in quiet reflection, not in retreat, but in rest. Like a man who had carried something heavy and was now ready to set it down. I've seen what happens when we abandon grace, he said. I've seen mothers bury their sons and blame themselves. I've seen good men undone by shame, and guilty ones hide behind laws written by cowards. I've seen the church both wound and restore. I've seen the sacred misused, and still, I believe in it. The silence that followed was not a void. It was space made for reflection. Leo looked into the camera again, into the homes of believers and skeptics alike, and his voice dropped lower, closer, like a grandfather at a bedside. We are caretakers of what is holy, he said. Not owners. Not exploiters. Caretakers. And that means we protect not just the symbols, but the people. The aching. The innocent. The forgotten. Another pause. A softer smile now. We don't need more voices shouting. He allowed the words to rest. We need more hearts, listening. The weight of it settled. Not just in the room, but in the hearts of those watching. In homes in Colorado and classrooms in Leeds. In cafes in Sydney and on quiet phones in Toronto, where the glow of the screen met the stillness of conviction. He had not defended his papacy. He had not justified every silence. He had not asked for agreement. He had simply shown who he had become. And in doing so, offered everyone watching a choice. This message is bigger than this video. Bigger than any argument, any platform, any doctrine. Subscribe to Circle of God's Glory if your heart feels even the smallest tremor of this truth. And if not, tell us, why don't you want to be part of something deeper? The screen did not fade to black. It lingered, longer than expected, as if the moment itself resisted conclusion. Pope Leo XIV had turned his face slightly away from the camera, not out of weariness, but as if listening for something distant. A sound the rest of the world could not hear. Perhaps a memory. Perhaps a name. Perhaps the weight of what he'd chosen not to say. His final words echoed still, reverberating not in sound but in spirit. And now, the silence was no longer between two men. It was between the story and the soul of the listener. Because this moment, this interview, was never just for broadcast. It was an altar, and each viewer had been invited to approach it. So we ask you now, what would you have said, if you were in that room? Not with hindsight. Not with certainty. But sitting where Marcus sat. Looking into the eyes of a man who carried secrets he never signed up to keep. Would you have pressed harder? Would you have softened? Would you have understood? Would you have asked him the one question no one dared to, did you see something, that changed you forever? And more than that, do you believe he did? Do you believe there is still such a thing, a moment so holy or so horrifying, that it cannot be spoken, only endured? The camera may have stopped recording. The interview may have ended. But the silence remains. And so we leave you with this, may we seek truth with humble hearts. May we stand when it is time to speak, and kneel when it is time to listen. May we carry our convictions gently, and never forget the weight of silence. This is Circle of God's Glory. If you felt anything, even a whisper, subscribe. And if you didn't, don't leave quietly. Drop your reason in the comments. Let the world hear where you stand.